Hello, my name is Aleksandra Kaminska and I'm presenting today with Géraldine Piguet on Odorama V2, prototyping touch smell synesthesia to promote neurocognitive empathy. Odorama V2 was Géraldine's master's thesis. So synesthesia is a condition in which the stimulation of one sense triggers another sense. So for example, we might associate or have experience of color when we hear certain words. It's a topic that has been largely, we could say, understudied, though there is growing interest in understanding this experience better. And one of the reasons why that's the case is virtual reality environments where we have to simulate the senses in order to have believable experiences in these artificial worlds. And the more we do so, the more immersed we will feel. So if we can taste, touch things in this virtual artificial environment, we will have a believable experience. Another example of senses coming up in a connected way here is with COVID-19 and the loss of smell that we believe that it triggers. So what happens if we lose a smell or a sense? Does it trigger other senses? What is the relationship between senses in a case like this? So synesthesia is a big topic. It deals with questions of sensation, perception, how we see the world and experience the world. And so it does bring up big questions in terms of similarities and differences between us.
So synesthesia is a benign neurological condition in which a subject experiences an automatic, involuntary, and idiosyncratic cross-activation of the senses, whereby the information from one sensory modality, for example sight, triggers the response from another, for example smell. So, for example, blue color makes you taste pineapple. Each time you see something blue, you taste pineapple. And like many sensory experience, it is difficult to express. Synesthetes have a particularly difficult time explaining how they sense and perceive the world to others. So as Richard Sitovich, an international expert about synesthesia, puts it, synesthesia highlights how each brain filters the world in its own uniquely subjective way. And it raises the question about perception and sensing. Do we share perception of the world, or are we stuck in our bodies? As you can see, there is many kinds of synesthesia, and the exact number of synesthetic form is unclear. It depends of the studies. Chaine2 outlines 73 different types, while Richard Sitovich and Egelman estimate that there is between 60 and 150 types of synesthetic form. Potentially, or any configuration of synesthesia should be possible. And we choose to work in a really specific one. It's touch smell synesthesia. It is really rare, as you can see. To our knowledge, there are no systematic dedicated studies of this type of synesthesia so far, which it's mean like texture, and texture that you touch triggers smell, various smell each time you touch this texture. We found a case, an example of people living with it, even though there is no study about it. There is one, Dawn Spencer-Hurwitz. She is a perfumer, and she says that when I smell smells, I see color and shape, and I feel texture, and it goes both ways. So our question in this paper and in our master thesis is to see if we can simulate a synesthete experience. We decided to conceive a prototype to better understand how synesthetes perceive the world, and ultimately to facilitate their inclusion by recreating the synesthete way of perceiving the world through physically engaging media. it will generate understanding and empathy. It was what we hoped, and the main question was, can we produce a prototype to simulate touch-smell synesthesia? So why do we need to implicate the body of the participants in these experiments to make them empathize and experiment synesthesia? Because humans rely on language to share and communicate with others, to project outwardly their experience in the hope of building an affective bond. But color have no description in natural science and can give any measurement to the presented stimuli. It means, like, for example, color have specific names and there is a variety of shade to describe and to qualify them. But with smell, we have no name at all. We always use an expression that it smells like something. It smells like a lemon or like a rose, or it smells sweet, which is a name for another kind of sense. Because no one can show you or explain you or exactly the perceived reality, we've tried to simulate this reality, the one of the touch-smell synesthete.
So in order to create an experience that will allow us to live a synesthetic simulation, we'd have to leave theory and text and language and think of a different methodology. So Géraldine explored the method and the tools of making and maker-culture. This was a world that was very new to Géraldine in terms of the tools and the culture itself, as she will discuss with you further. It provided some challenges, but it also it provided the possibility of doing something that allowed testing, allowed failure, allowed trial, and it allowed the production of an artifact that would test the hypothesis, or at least confront Géraldine with certain questions around the hypothesis through making. So it is part of that kind of culture in which this project emerged.
There was no technology doing what we wanted to do, but there is still some technology implicating smell and touch. But as Louise Poisson said it, when we work on senses, you see that the complexity of the function of the eyes and the sensory organ is really complex. And the complexity of the senses equals the complexity of the technology. For the smell, there is some smell technologies. It's called digital scent technology. And there is 3 components to take in part. First one is sensing and recording the smell, or creating it from chemical component. The second one is preserving the smell in a way that is stable, because smells are really volatile. And 3, there is diffusing the smell in the space and time. So for each of these parts, there is different kind of technology involved. About touch, it's really complex because the tension of this stage of the sense of touch, it involves actually the experience of temperature, the experience of pain, the experience of a direct contact, and the texture of the thing we touch, all in the same time. You all know some touch technology, for example, the one in your smartphone, but it's more like a force feedback effect involved than a really touch technology. So to actually create a technology extending smell and touch, you have to recreate all the action performed by our sensory organ at a really fast speed. And when you deal with synesthesia, it's even more complicated because there is 2 senses working at the same time. So how did we do it? First step in our process, we started with a review of accessible technologies, research of what I could get my hands on and how to use them. And then I've set and extract specification requirements. The first one was a low production cost, because the price of some technology rises really fast. The second one was accessibility of the material. It has to be found really easily, and I had to be able to learn how to use them on my own. And potential of reproduction, we designed a prototype which could be made more than one time, because our project came with an experiment scenario where more than one person experienced the synesthetic sensibility at the same time. We wanted at least 3 persons to have the experience at the same time, so our prototype had to be really easily reproduced. And 4 and 5, compact and made for individual use, is because we wanted the participant to forget about it. It must be compact and really easily hide on the person. And really important, it needed to be inoffensive and safe, because when you create something new, you must try to anticipate all the potential dangers that could result with any of your technological choices. Regarding all this requirement, we choose to use an Arduino. We call it Arduino Mon Amour because we have a kind of love-hate relationship with this microcontroller. It is called, as you know, as the Swiss Army knife of the electronics, because it's multipotential, cheap, and easy, air quotes on easy. And it's really important for the maker culture, and there is many person using it, as you know. But it seems to be a little bit harder to use than some people claim. And big part of my journey was to understand the logic behind the tutorial I saw, to be able to extract from them. So we conceived 2-part experiments. And how does it work? It works like the participants enter the room, and in the room there is different elements the person can interact with, and some of them are connected to the fixed component, where you have a representation, a sketch of it in front of you. And when they interact with this part, they touch it, and there is a captor sensing that the texture has been touched, and it records this information, and it sends it to the mobile part, which is on the participant, and the participant, she is or he is, working with it in the room. The other part is the mobile component, where there is all the smell capsule inside, and it's called the box of smell. We can call it like that. And it works with fan and other caps. And quick explanation, it's like the hand touch one's texture, the fixed part of the device records the interaction, it sends the information to the mobile part, which is on the participant, and he is carrying it with him on his neck. And it triggers the fan related to the texture. So the fan starts to turn, and the smell is propelled to the nose of the participant. The 2 cords that you can see here worked with radio frequency transmission, but it was our first attempt, and it didn't work as planned, because we use a 433 MHz transmitter and receiver, but there were a lot of noises, and it was the transmission was often parasites, and so the connection didn't work that well. So here you have a picture of the inside of the 2 parts. We actually never built the case or the scenography, because it took us so much time to create those parts that we ran out of time. And we stopped our process at some point because our knowing and abilities didn't allow us to go further, even though we had help. But in the process of making, the process of making always has been more important than the result, and we learned many things from the road. What we learned was that coding is also a language, in the way that the prototype required that we learn in its language and that we submit to the logic of programming, and the constraints were shifted but not erased. So it was just another kind of language we had to learn to be able to create and to simulate something else. Also, one of our questions was, is it even possible to build something that simulates this kind of synesthesia? Because more we knew about it, more we learned about it, more we realized how difficult it would be to fully comprehend the extent of the synesthetic realities through a technological dispositif. Also, because I'm a woman and I'm a neophyte in the maker movement, I was confronted to many challenges, which told me that there was a lack of diversity and inclusion in the maker movement. And the really good outcomes was that while I was working on my project, prototyping, made me have a really different conversation with different people, and more I talked about synesthesia, more I realized that how few people knew about it, and so this project helped spread the knowledge about synesthesia and maybe help to enhance empathy. So that's all for us, and thank you so much for listening to us. If you are interested in discovering my whole project, you can read my thesis in Papyrus. It's all in French, but you can find it in clicking on the link. Have a great day, and thank you.
This presentation is a snapshot of the creative Sisonanze di Vino project that I conducted in southern Italy with wine growers during the 2018 vintage. It sought to explore resonances between the senses, nature and culture, using the non-visual senses as the main instruments of inquiry. This was specifically focused on observing the intuitive ways the wine growers worked with their senses, and used this to orient the creation of a series of wine grower-specific audio-gustatory artworks. These sensory connections were tuned further through harnessing cross-modal correspondences, shared sentient interactions unearthed from just beneath the surface of consciousness. Sisonanze di Vino involved a practical application of my concept of sensory terroir, an interlaced sensuous system that draws on the connections between the senses, environments, people, and the multisensory imagination. This uses a metaphor harvested from the French concept of terroir, terroir being the symbiotic interactions between the features of an environment, its soil, topography, climate, organisms, and human culture that together form the unique character consistently reflected in the sensory experiences of wine from that site. In the sensory terroir, this resonates with the idea that the senses are a simply complex synergistic system that together form a distinctive perceptual experience. In Sisonanze di Vino, I attempted to engage with the sensory terroir of the wine growers through the creation of a series of individual multisensory works that attempt to transmit the interplay of their cultural, personal, and sensory experience of their wines and land, mediated through my own multisensory imagination. While sensory terroir is not limited to wine-related connections, it can be applied to all imaginative sensorial networks, actual wine terroir is fertile ground for its application, given its existing web of connections to tap into. Wine terroir resonates with potential. Wine writer Matt Kramer proposes it as a metaphor to engender a sensitive exchange with nature, as a way of being alert and of both acknowledging and accepting that the earth, not just the soil, can speak. While in Amy Trubeck's anthropological interpretation of terroir, this earth is in dialogue with culture, in the form of a group's identity, traditions, and heritage in relation to place. The cultural approach of this project was informed by ideas from sensory anthropology, which highlights how sensory hierarchies can differ between cultures. From previous trips across Italy as both a sound artist and wine writer, it became evident that taste was deeply rooted and more privileged in Italian regional cultures than my own Anglo-Celtic culture. For Italians, taste appears almost a social sense, described by Carlo Petrini, the founder of the slow food movement, as a pact of fellowship and a program of cultural integration. However, I wasn't able to find any formal studies that compared actual sensory engagement between these cultures. But given language has been found to reflect a culture's sensory model, I drew on a study by Elena Manca that used linguistic and cultural analysis of sensory descriptions of British and Italian tourism websites, which uncovered some marked differences. For example, the Italian descriptions regularly employed sensory imagery with numerous references to aromas and flavours, the latter often linked to tradition. In contrast, the British prose was more factual, the term taste largely used in the sense of personal preference, while sounds were referenced more often, suggesting the possibility of a higher level of cultural engagement with hearing. In the Campania region, where the Sisonanze di Vino project was based, wine's been made since Roman times and remains an important part of the area's cultural, social, and economic identity. However, younger generations have been leaving its countryside to find physically easier and more lucrative work in the cities. The 6 wineries that I chose to work with were all smaller, predominantly organic operations, factors that foster a hands-on connection between the wine grower and their wines and land and encourage greater sensory emotional bonds, something I considered might produce deeper resonances for me to tune into. As people working so closely with taste in a culture where this sense is so highly appreciated, I hoped that this potentially ultra-heightened sensory engagement of the wine growers would offer a powerful orientation with this sense in my relatively short period of time with each winery. I had less idea about the relationships I was going to discover with sound, given questions over the ranking of hearing within Italian culture, and as a more peripheral sense in winemaking itself. In my visit to each wine grower, I firstly sought to understand how the wine grower's interaction with nature shaped the character of the final wine and how this might be driven by personal, cultural, and historical factors. My investigations then moved to sensory terroir to discover how each wine grower's sense of smell, taste, and hearing connected them to their general work in winemaking and specifically to their land. I tasted their wines, noting the way that they described their sensory characters as well as my own perceptions. These sensory observations of varying depth and detail helped guide the digital audio recordings I went on to make in their vineyards and wineries, and the selection of the wine from each that was used in the final works. Using each wine grower's sensory feedback as a framework, I created 6 individual sensory terroir specific artworks that combined one of their wines, tasted as part of the work, with a soundscape made from the recordings of their site. I also sought to deepen the sensorial dimension of the works through harnessing perceptual resonance between the sounds and the wines. These cross-modal correspondences, as they are often called, the universal tendency of a sensory feature in one modality to be matched with one from another sensory modality. I use these to better tune into the correspondences in those environments, employing my inesthetic mapping system that I've developed to help identify correspondences between salient characters of wines and sounds. The cross-modal tuning of the wine and sounds in the creative works sought to heighten the perception of salient sensory connections, expanding sentience through drawing attention to interactions that often remain beneath the level of consciousness, but that we share. The 6 works created in Sisonanze di Vino were first presented in Campania at the end of the residency in which I created them, 3 of which I'm going to briefly present now, accompanied by the audio, but sadly not the wines in this virtual platform. These works are interspersed with some more general observations that I made during my creative studies. The first work is Montagna Mia. This was created from a meeting with the Masseria Frattasi's Pasquale Clemente on Mount Taburno. I love the mountain. I love making mountain wines, Pasquale enthuses. We're at an altitude of almost 1,000 meters with a storm approaching. Before it breaks, Pasquale wants me to literally feel the excitement he experiences in the mountain's rocks. In a fast-paced tour of his mountain sites, he picks up pieces of the limestone that cover his vineyards, showing me the ancient marine life fossilized within the rock. He gets me to feel their rough, crumbly surface. This situated sensory experience in the vineyards is obviously crucial to him and the way that he relates to his land and his wines. He reveals that he told one potential overseas distributor that he'd only sell them his wines if they first came to visit his vineyards. As well as interacting with his own plantings, he also takes me to experience some rough-barked 200-year-old vines, saved by their lofty isolation from the vine disease that destroyed much of Europe's vineyards in the late 1800s. He's taken cuttings from these, which he plans to establish a new vineyard from to preserve the old wine heritage. Both the wine and the soundscape, both the wine I used and the soundscape I created, hail from over 800 metres up from Mount Taberno. The vineyards were dramatic, made even more so as rolling thunder increased in volume and rain began to crash down. The sound of the rain, captured close, battering the leaves of the vines, seemed well suited to the high acidity of Masseria Frattasi's high elevation Sauvignon Blanc. The rocks also form part of the soundscape. I endeavoured to translate their texture through the slightly rough timbre and high pitch created when I hit or scrape them together, which works in synergy with the minerality of the wine. Talking to a wine grower like Pasquale Clemente revealed often deep sensory connections between them and their environments, from the logical and the pragmatic to the intuitive and affective. These range from the audible reassurance provided by the regular whir of winemaking machinery, to the powerful embodied sensorial impulsion that had drawn some of the wine growers to the wine and the land away from their original career paths. Antonio Parisi is one such wine grower. Despite his own parents warning him against becoming involved in the unprofitable business of wine, he abandoned university to return to run his small family wine company. He takes me to a quiet, well-ventilated shed where newly harvested Moscato grapes are just starting their process to become Passito. This Passito is a wine style dating back to pre-Roman times where grapes are dried to concentrate their sugar. The area's dry winds are essential to this process, and today the muted sound of a gentle breeze drifts through the racks of grapes. He converted to the family vineyards to organic when he took over. This is a practice close to that of his great-grandfather, who started the family wine-growing tradition, making wines for the local barons. In his vineyards on the high ground near the Campania-Puglia border, pictured here, winds sough up the steep hillsides, rustling the vine leaves and dense organic growth beneath. Antonio speaks of the peace and meditative nature of wine growing, which was one of the aspects that attracted him back to work on his family's land. With its crisp, pure and light character, Masseria Parisi's Moscato Spumante was best suited to the higher pitch and timbre of the recordings I made in the estate's elevated windy vineyards. From these I created a sympathetic soundscape for his newly fermented sparkling wine that cycles between and merges with the wind through the vineyards and effervescence of Antonio's newest wine fermenting. I sought to capture the sense of peace that was so important to Antonio, but also a dynamic excitement propelled by the currents of fresh air. Questions relating to the perceptions of sound initially appeared somewhat perplexing to some of the wine growers. And in one case, I even alerted a vigneron to his wine had actually started fermenting through my own listening. However, most was able to articulate to some extent how they engaged with sound in their work. The most multi-sensory sensitivity of any of the wine growers I encountered was of Daniela de Gruttola of Cantina Giardino, pictured here. She described how she'd noticed sonic and olfactory shifts in the agricultural senscape over decades, driven by changing agricultural practices. She tells me, it's important for us to remember that the sounds and the smells of the countryside we were used to when we were young were lost. When we started working with the vineyards here in around 2000, these no longer existed. However, since starting the winery as a cultural project to preserve old vines and wine-growing traditions under threat from modern agricultural practices, biodiversity has increased and the senscape has changed. Now we have recovered these sounds and smells of the past, she states. Cantina Giardino is the least interventionist winery that I visit. They manage their vineyards organically and make their wines in vats made of local wood or amphora, some of which they made themselves from clay of their own vineyards. The group of friends that own the winery have been buying vineyards containing old vines abandoned for those considering them unprofitable. De Gruttola observes, in this earthquake region where we don't have old buildings, we think these old vines are our historic centre. De Gruttola tells me how you can hear the sound of creatures in the soil when you don't use chemicals in the vineyards. Many of these benefit the wines, and even those that don't, as illustrated by the whine of mosquitoes she noted in a particularly wet season, she won't kill them, as she considers them part of the vineyard ecosystem. She takes me through her Chanzano vineyard, burying her nose deep into bunches of grapes to check for ripeness, with the smell of the vineyard guiding her instincts on how the wine is to be made in each vintage. She tastes the grapes as she passes through the vines, noting that the Côte de Volpe variety is ready when the seeds crunch. I endeavoured to capture the sounds of life in the soil, but just as Cantina Giardino stressed the importance of the natural unfolding of time in the making of their wines, this required longer than my short period with them allowed. Nevertheless, I used the deep notes from the heavy clay soil to mirror the dense layers of its richly textured Bianco wine, matured in an amphora and made in the traditional Ramato style. This is when white grapes are fermented with their skins. Sonic textures from the vine leaves and the plant growth under the vine were used to complement its gentle pithy character, with a fizzing wild fermentation used to underpin the wine's fresh grapefruit-like balsamic acidity. As I had imagined, the wine growers who were most directly involved with the physical, embodied wine growing process appeared more attuned to their senses of touch, smell, and taste in particular. From charting this sensory terroir, it emerged the greater the sensory engagement of the wine grower, the lighter their touch on the natural environment with which they worked. In response to this more sensitive handling, these environments appeared more sensorially vibrant, teeming with life and the more complex sounds, smells, and tastes this produced. The brevity of the project did not let me dig very deep into the wine growers' shared culture. However, my interactions with them as individuals revealed their senses often powerfully connected them to their historic vineyard land and traditional practices. Thank you.
Inhaling Consciousness, Ecological Sentience at Molecular Level. This paper presents and discusses the series Inhaling Consciousness, investigating the bioart potential to activate an ecological consciousness in the audience, exploring the neologism multimedia introduced by the author. The work is the product of a 2-year investigation and explores sentience from a cross-scale perspective, encapsulating influences from Brazilian neoconcrete movement, such as the concept of a transobject, considering the intention of incorporating an ordinary object into an idea, make it part of the genesis of the work without losing its previous structure. The apparatus is adapted from a medical inhalation breathing system, considering an aesthetic and conceptual relation with 2 references, Hélio Oiticica's B50 Bolli 2 olfactic, plastic, rubber, and coffee, and Barbarella movie's giant hookah, which dispenses essence of man. The work evokes perspectives in which consciousness and the self can be seen as emergencies from plurisystemic conversations within the environment. The work was recently installed in Porto, Portugal, as part of the Consciousness Reframed Conference's jury the exhibition Sentient States, Biomind, and Techno-Nature in June 2019. The work explores possible integrations and information exchange between above-ground cortex microbiome and the human respiratory and digestive systems 1. For the version installed in June 2019 in Porto, considering Portugal is a major cork grower producing nearly half of the cork harvested annually in the world, the species covering approximately 8% of the total area of the country, the intention was to offer to the audience the opportunity to reflect about the complexity of a molecular level integration between Portugal humans population and the plant kingdom 1. Considering potential horizontal gene transfers between these 2 very eclectic populations of microorganisms, the work invites to reflect on the impact this dialogue that happens at molecular level can have in shaping behavioral patterns, influencing the emergence of an expanded shared consciousness of the multi- and unicellular peninsula inhabitants. The work consists of a transobject from the appropriation of and transformation adaptation of a nebulizer, a medical cool mist inhaler, and accessories, tubbing, cup, mask, a reservoir bag, and a dust particle sensor system attached, Arduino sharp dust sensor, and LCD, having a cork oak tree bark sample inside of the bag. For the version installed in Porto in June 2019, the artist had in the interior of the plastic vapor chamber a cork oak tree bark excerpt extracted from her grandpa lands in the village of Fogoso, Raiva, Castelo de Paiva, Portugal. Considering the invitation for the audience to inhale a sample of the tree bark's microscopic inhabitants, inviting those contaminants inside of the human body, the installation plays with instinctive reactions and invites to reflect on our vital relation with microorganisms populations. Considering the reaction of the audience in the first time the work was installed in 2019, it was interesting to observe how open to the experience all the visitors were. How could they suppress the protection against stimulation? According to Ing. Hitterwallner, in works such as Oiticica's B50 bag balled tool pattern, first of all, the open arrangement should meet participants ready to open themselves up, and as a second step, it should make this openness productive. For a long time, a weak filter mechanism was restricted to psychopathological findings in patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. Ing. Hitterwallner mentions that psychologists Shelley Carson and Jordan Peterson offer an additional perspective looking at the possible connection between latent inhibition, the personality trait openness to experience, and creativity. They found out that under some conditions, a reduced filtering of stimuli can become productive. Nevertheless, under the light of the most recent findings in the study of human microbiome, since in patients diagnosed with schizophrenia we have dysbiosis, dysbacteriosis, or a microbial imbalance, implying the prevalence of monotonic species such as lactobacillus in our gut biome, the behavior can be directed by a need for contamination. That means to potentially stimulate the growth of a health microbiome. The message that directs the behavior can possibly come from a molecular level. Here, Almeida is the message. Inhaling consciousness is part of the artist's effort in exploring the body itself in its communication complexity. The consideration of the human body as something potentially central in the poetics is dissolved by the poetics itself. What remains as central is the integration between this definition, that is the human body, and the environment in a molecular level. Body and environment disappear if we think about the chemical traits as traits that shape who we are, the way we perceive the world, the phenomenal world created. For ISEA 2020 in Montreal, a variation of the artwork was considered, addressing local ecological issues from a panpsychic perspective, replacing the cork oak by the coffee tree, a threatened species in Canada. The intention in proposing this potential installation for ISEA 2020 as an add to the paper presentation, not necessarily for the jury the exhibition, was to bring the reflection the work awakes closer to the host city and country's inhabitants. The poetics embraces the panpsychist philosophy perspective brought by Alfred North Whitehead, exploring the subtle relation between living entities, human native cells and hosted microbiome, and lifeless matter, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. Facing the restrictions imposed by COVID-19 pandemic, leading to an online version of ISEA 2020, an alternative version was developed, exploring the above-ground trees microbiome from the city the artist is based at the moment in Brazil. For these versions of the installation, the sensor placed inside of the vapor chamber, attached to the breathing mask, the dust sensor, measures the total dust density inside of the chamber. This total includes concentrations of 1 micron particles, 2.5 micron particles, and 10 micron particles. The information is visualized in a small LCD attached to the Arduino, bringing together the phrase inhaling consciousness. The Terminalia catapa species is abundant in the city of Fortaleza urban area and all along Brazilian Atlantic coast. It is a large tropical tree in the leadwood tree family that grows mainly in the tropical regions of Asia, Africa, and Australia. Common names in English can include sea almond, tropical almond, and beach almond, to mention a few. Considering most bacterium range from 0.2 to 2 micrometers in diameter, by accepting the invitation, the audience is open to get consciously invaded by the tree's philosphere's microinhabitants. Philosphere is a term used in microbiology to refer to the total above-ground portions of plants as habitat for microorganisms. The philosphere is both scientifically and economically an important habitat in which to study microbial ecology. Through molecular level exchange of information, human body and its hosted microbiome population continuously change themselves in dialogue with external microbiome populations that enters the body through breathing, eating, touching. This process is responsible for continually reshaping the self. Inhaling consciousness invites to meditate on these vital relations by having a seat and calmly enjoying breathing or being fulfilled by the inhabitants of trees' philosphere, the total above-ground portions of plants as habitat for microorganisms. Inhaling, we are exchanging information at elementary entities level. Combining odors from the single-celled and multicellular organisms that inhabit trees' bark and by the tree cells themselves, the main reflection that structures the artwork implies interrogating if the odors, since they are derived from chemical substances, molecules, can encapsulate beyond intimate memories, molecular memories of ecological evolutionary interferences in our intrinsic relation with the environment, from the origins of single-celled life forms to our controversial Anthropocene. Consciousness, understood as an emergent phenomenon, can be seen as a resultant of these molecular conversations that transverse scales and capture ecological and cosmological time. Thank you.
Unmute myself as well. Hi everyone, nice to see you and welcome to this panel. First of all, thank you very much to all the presenters. We've heard 3 really exciting prospects on how indeed we can think differently about our bodily functions in relation to nature and technology. My name is Annet Dekker. I will be joining you as a moderator here today for this panel. And just to briefly touch up on how and what has happened just now is that in the first presentation, we had a lovely talk about synesthesia and how synesthesia is often actually misunderstood in order to overcome that, these two researchers came up with this beautiful idea to use technology to also learn us what it is like to be a synesthete. Well, I'd love to know indeed what a synesthete is experiencing, so I'm really looking forward to it, to hearing more about also how this has happened and what the feedback was like. In the second presentation, we had a totally different synesthetic experience, at least for me. I think that came out through thinking about wine and wine growers and how indeed that kind of can be used in different ways, not just as for wine drinking, as most of you I'm sure are familiar with, but much more also for composing music. So I'm really curious to hear more from her as well in this level. And then finally, we moved to Brazil, inhaling consciousness through investigating the bio-eye potential to activate the ecological consciousness. So we've had already quite a few interesting questions coming up. So we'll just start immediately indeed with the first question that came up, and which is directed to the first presentation, Géraldine and Aleksandra. It's posed by Joseph Bahn and is asking, given the challenges you encountered in your research, if you could take another step at exploring synesthetic scent touch again, how would you approach it differently? Presuming that this wasn't already a great experiment.
I'm sorry, I think I didn't hear the last part of your question.
How would you approach your experiment differently now that you've learned from your first experiment?
Okay, thanks for the question. First, I think I would look more for some people who has this kind of synesthesia, because as I explained in the paper, this is a really rare one. It's really hard to find someone who actually has it and lives with it. So I would make more research to find this kind of person. If someone is listening to me and has this type of synesthesia, please get in touch with me, because I would like to have more details about the total comparison of the experiment of the world. And also I would get more people to help me to set different kind of technological device, and it takes the time to experiment more kind of different, not just focus on one, but try to use more different device. I don't know if it makes sense.
Do you have anything to add to that, Aleksandra?
Well, I think the project really was Géraldine's project, and so it was sort of conceived by her, and I was sort of supporting her. But I think the constraints of just working with the master's project, working within a one year sort of restraint, and working with learning already the tools that she had to learn was enough. So I think the next step would obviously be having learned those things, and you can build on those experiences and those tools, and then you kind of have a better sense of what you might need next. I think that a lot of time was spent just understanding what could be done with the tools at hand, with the Arduinos, and which Arduino you would need. So I think just the next steps would be natural progressions from already what had been learned the first year. So that would be my insight on Géraldine's projects. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I have another question for you, and because it follows, I think, nicely from the first one, we'll pose it immediately now. It's by Lisa Mansfield, and she's asking, did you work with people with smell touch sensitivities? And if so, did your project realistically simulate their experience? Did you come across any research on creating a non-synesthetic experience for those with synesthesia?
First, I didn't find anyone who has this kind of synesthesia, as I said, so I didn't work with people who have this kind of sensitivity, because
I actually didn't, because like as Aleksandra said before, it was a master thesis, so I didn't have so much time to explore really like the difference you have. And so I went to look for some description in some papers, and it's actually really hard to find some person who can describe what they experiment on this. And what I found, and as I explained in the paper, it's like I just found some description of this kind of synesthesia with people who suffer from schizophrenia, actually, because it's a kind of hallucination they can experiment. Like when the air enters the nostril, it makes experiment the odors. But there is no odors, you know, like the simulation, it's just the air touching the nose. And so this is what I could get my hands on in terms of description. So yeah, it was not really, let's say, precise.
I think we could add also that in your research you did find people that had different types of synesthesia, but you just chose to kind of focus on one that was particularly rare, just to add a different challenge or dimension to it. So it could have been a project that had to do with more common synesthesias. I don't remember which ones they were, but they, like the ones that are are known, that we know more about. But it was sort of, I think the idea was to try to experience something and to create something that is precisely so unknown and so misunderstood, or so hard to even imagine what that might be like.
But to add also about that, it's because there is something called Synesthesia List for the one who are really interested in synesthesia, and it's a forum where people speak about the form of synesthesia, and there is many people, not many people, there is some discussion about different form of odors, which triggers, for example, colors and stuff like that. So I went really close to the description of my type of synesthesia I was studying, because those were kind of the same. I mean, it's more an extrapolation I made based on the description. For example, like what I found, it was some perfumers who create perfumes have kind of a similar kind of synesthesia, of this kind of synesthesia, which work also with taste. But I would need to meet this person and to have kind of an interview, a full interview to understand everything. And I didn't have time to do that, but I wish I could.
Yeah, it's really a shame. I mean, it would be really great. I mean, I think one of the most difficult things that we have here now, that being online, that we actually can't experience it. And I agree also with some of the comments that are made in the chat that, yeah, it would be, you need to kind of experience this as well to see what works and how does it work and what does it bring indeed. I was having one more question for you guys as well. Because a lot of the synesthesia experiments have taken place by inducing drugs. How have you related to those kind of experiments, or have you at all?
It's actually a really interesting question, because when I explained my project in the first year, one of my colleagues in the class just told me, like, you just have to drug all your audience and it will be like done. And I was like, I'm not sure like the ethics committee is going to agree with your test, but thanks for
you should come to Holland for that.
Yeah, but the whole idea is like, if you take drugs, you know, like your state of mind is different because you actually took the drug. So you already changed the perspective. What is interesting with synesthesia is that the person experienced normal life, daily life with this difference. And what I was really looking for, it was to make this experience. What makes my master thesis really hard is I didn't want to make like something. I didn't want to make the experience like synesthesia, like, because there is like many artworks really incredible about that. And for example, like sounds and visualization of the sound, which take place in screens. And because they take place in screens, they are like out of the body of the person. And what I wanted, it was to create a really, really small device, something that can be forgotten. And so it makes everything really hard, because I didn't want to make something like synesthesia. I wanted to make the person experiment something like kind of synesthesia, like to extra body it. I don't know if it's a word, but you understood. And so tracks can't work for that, because like you've taken something.
Yeah.
Did you girls look for the molecular or chemo basis of synesthesia?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'm just asking if by chance you're interested in investigating the molecular basis or chemo basis of synesthesia. Did you hear? Oh my God, that's, my phone is disconnected. That's it. Sorry for that. Did you hear me now?
No, I understood like thesis, molecular synesthesia. Was it that?
No. Yeah. The foundation, the molecular foundations of chemo foundations of the phenomena.
Like you mean in a scientist's way, like how it works in the brain?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, but not in the brain. Since when you have some stimuli, yeah, when you sense, when you are using the sense, it's chemo information that's circulating in the body. And so I'm just trying to find some connections between our the conversations we're bringing today. Since I'm interested in the chemo integrations, and we were talking about the sense, just curious to know if you were touching this realm, or if you're interested in exploring how these molecules, when we sense, no matter it's touch, because it's all chemical. Yeah, we have potassium, sodium, blah blah blah. Yeah, even when we're watching something, it's chemical. Yeah, and just asking if by chance you envisage the possibility of exploring this more chemo based side of synesthesia.
But what happened, like, it's a really interesting question, because I really feel like what makes my project difficult was the fact that the sense of inhaling is really hard, because it's all volatile and it's all like something which is chemical, and it's not because you recreate the chemo that it will work in the brain of the person. I mean, it won't produce something because there is something more happening, and it's a whole kind of interaction, which is really particular to each person. And this is what is really interesting for me. But we didn't have really the time to explore the specific aspects. But I felt like in your paper, it's really interesting because of that, because of all what came with the sense of smell.
I think we can also just add that your focus on what I found really interesting in how you framed the project was that it was not framed as a sort of chemical question, but framed as a neurological question. And this is something that's sort of more expanded on in your actual thesis, but it's the whole question of neurodiversity, and the motivation for the project was one to create neurodiverse experiences. So I think that your framework was more neurological than it was chemical. Yeah.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, it's more about the experience and the relation to creativity and how it fits memories. But I in the end, I forgot about bringing or explaining the idea of media. Yeah, this idea of considering we have information flowing at molecular or elementary entities level, and I think that was the main point in proposing the installation. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. I have a question for Joe, actually, from Joel Ong, and he says, well, salute. And I'm not saying that I'm pronouncing that really well in Italian, but the question is, how has the aesthetic appreciation of wine as a finished product, that is to say, the opening of the bottle as a rupture in the development phase, provided creative friction with artistic engagements with the earth's soil that are more typically unfolding relationships over time.
Actually, sorry, could you say that again? I'm having a bit of issue with the connection. It was a bit broken up.
Absolutely. How has the aesthetic appreciation of wine as a finished product, that is to say, the opening of the bottle as a rupture in the development phase, provided creative friction with artistic engagements with the earth's soil that are more typically unfolding relationships over time?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think. I guess like this project has actually kind of brought, I mean, there's a whole idea with wine that you actually kind of, you're tasting the soil, you're tasting the place within that kind of sensory experience. And I guess kind of the aesthetic experiences that I'm kind of seeking to create in a project like Sisonanze de Vino are kind of making more of this kind of wider framework of connections, the aesthetic experience of not only kind of the soil and the vineyard and the time that the wine was made, but also kind of bringing in a lot more into focus the human interactions, which sometimes also get written out of the idea of terroir. Sometimes humans are kind of sidelined in that, and it's all about just these interactions that go on within the vineyard. But I was quite keen in this project to the humans were very much part of those interactions, what they were doing and the ways that they related to their vineyards, their soils, the plants, the environment that they worked in. Just adding these extra layers to the experience. I was going to maintain that kind of certainly kind of tasting a wine is an aesthetic experience, and this potentially kind of highlights that even further by trying to kind of add in these extra layers in, and definitely framing the wine within a context of an aesthetic work.
Yeah, interesting. It's really nice to hear you say like wine tasting is an aesthetic experience. I can totally imagine saying that in the bar next week. So I'm really happy with that one. But just to stick with you in a way, because there's another interesting question I think that kind of moves on from here, from Lauren Bergantini. And she asks, in your research, did you find common cross-modal associations between different descriptions of the wines by different people? And do you think these associations are specific from or to Italy?
One of the main issues I had when I was actually talking to the wine growers is that I don't speak very good Italian. So I had to have interpreters a lot of the time when people were speaking Italian. So there was probably quite a bit that's kind of lost in translation. But certainly in my wider research, I kind of have looked at the way that people talk about wine and describe wine, and kind of found that there's kind of consistent and shared ways that people talk about wine. For example, the idea of brightness in a wine, and not talking about the visual, but talking about a quality of acidity, which seems to be something that kind of always, that seems to emerge. And then that can get kind of fused with different kind of language elements and kind of go across kind of the senses, this kind of brightness almost as a suprasensory description, which kind of can link it in when people are talking about wine to kind of other characteristics and purity and things like that. So yeah, the language was a bit of a barrier when I was in Italy, but certainly I have found shared ways that people evoke wine experience, which has a cross-modal dimension.
I mean, I remember you saying in the presentation that it kind of struck me that you had these three examples, 2 men and 1 woman. And you said the most sensitivity that was mentioned was by this woman, Daniela de Grutola. Do you see there's also a gender sensitivity in that way? Or is that more a social, cultural, related question in a sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. To be honest, a lot of the majority of the people that I interacted with in Italy were actually male, and I think Daniela was the only woman. And yeah, I probably don't have enough of a sample size of that particular study to make an observation. I mean, I'm not sure if it is a gendered thing. I mean, she and her whole the group of friends, which were kind of mixed gender, they had the most. I mean, the connection that I made was they were the group that were doing things the most naturally. They weren't using chemicals. They were very hands-on in the vineyard. So it kind of seemed to make sense that that she, as the kind of representative of that group, had the greatest sensitivity to what was going on. She was the only person that really completely brought the whole multisensory experience of wine growing together, and the fact that she had actually discerned these shifts in smell and sound over the years. It seemed very, very acute, and but I'm not sure if that was anything to do with gender.
No, I can imagine that's hard to say. I just have to think about it, because often also when wine tastings are often also done by women, because they have a better nose for smelling the smell, but that might also be a very social, cultural, gender trope in that way.
Yeah,
I have another. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think kind of women tend to be able to kind of talk better about wine. In the experience that I've had, they seem to talk in a different way to men. Very often men are making comparisons to what they've already tried, and in my experience, women tend to actually try a bit harder, maybe to evoke the actual sensory experience of wine tasting. That's just my anecdotal observation on that.
Okay. Let's go for another question. This one is for Clarissa, and it's posed by Mert Akbar. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he's asking, can communication be both ways in your examples? Is the almond tree also capable to inhale the human molecules? Is a conversation possible by exchanging that kind of information?
Okay, Mert. First, I say hi to him. Yeah, in the end, I'm not talking exactly about the tree itself, but the above ground, the hemisphere microbiome. Yeah, but for sure, the composition of this population is impacted by our presence, and not only the presence of humans, but if you talk about trees that exist in urban environments, we have a bunch of chemicals around it, cars and business producing the most different kind of things, and yeah, it's not as in nature or an idea we have of an untouched original nature, but yeah, you can see it's both sides, but not exactly related to the tree itself, because the idea is to focus in the small scale of the elementary entities. Could be molecules, could go deeper and talk about atoms and subatomic particles. And I'm happy to be part of this this session today, because I found deeper interconnections between all the papers, the investigations and explorations here. and mainly when you consider these molecular or entity levels integrations can trigger, can stimulate senses. But well, how can I say something about a bacteria sensorium? Yeah. Or the sentience or the consciousness in a bacteria, or the microorganisms population that inhabits the bark of a tree as a whole. Yeah, we are starting this investigations, researching this consciousness in this different realms or scales. Maybe in a few years we can understand better the impact in the mind of a bacterial colony that inhabits the philosphere, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that elaboration as well. I was wondering also with your project, I mean, in light of climate change and pollution, in what way would that influence your research?
Well, yeah. in the research itself, I think it could be a topic to explore, since the composition, the chemical composition of the atmosphere in microclimate, or you consider like a more global climate, impacts the composition of the colonies in our skins, in the trees, philosphere, in all the surfaces we have around and inside. And this week I was reading an interesting paper about, because of all those fires around, yeah, in Brazil we have huge destruction of natural environments. And the paper was relating the fires, or the way they spread, to the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, and just talking about like from the time of the dinosaurs to nowadays. And all the time we have the level of oxygen going up. The fires, they are just spreading around the globe, and they help actually balance the balance or the equilibrium, and so we can have life on Earth. And it's another way to see the fires, because mainly we see as a bad thing, yeah. And so we stop considering sometimes we need them as part of the entire planet balance. But yes, could be a topic, but it's not a topic at the moment, since I'm focusing on this mainly on the molecules in this project, and another project on the molecules produced by the microorganisms. Even when we inhale or we eat something that are just the remaining parts of this structure that's a molecule or a protein, the information is still there. So if we break or we kill a bacteria, or kill a fungi, or we kill a virus, the remaining information or the fragments, they still can travel through our nervous system or through our body's different systems, and can make us what we are together with them. This is the main integration. And if you have this artificial engineered chemicals, for sure they influence, yeah. But it's not the main focus to talk about the artificial chemicals at the moment. My main focus is on the chemicals, the native information we have. No matter the artificial chemicals, they can bring mutations. Yeah, they can change the structure of DNA or RNA, whatever. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I have a general question, anyway, not a general question, but a question to you all, basically, by Jenny Filippati. And she thanks you all for sharing the great work and process. And she's curious, and the question is, did you share some of this context when the work was exhibited? context that you're explaining about now and all of your researchers. For example, for Joe, the stories of the vineyards, and for Clarissa, for example, the information about the bark. Why would you or why would you not share that information? And if you did, how was it conveyed? How did people experience it?
Okay. Well, the first time I installed last year was in Portugal, and the idea was to talk about this information in relation to the inhabitants of the country, yeah. And so I was sure explaining, and I gave a talk as well. It was a conference together with an exhibition, and I was there, and I was sharing this information about the origin of the bark and the tree and the relation to my personal memories from my childhood and the relation to the country. I thought it was important because one of the goals, if I can say something like this, considering it's an artwork, is to bring awareness about our intimate relation to environment from a cross-scale perspective, nor only. Yeah, I think it's a point in common to all our explorations here today. Yeah, it's to navigate scales and bring consciousness from places we are not invited to explore every day, like the sound or, the combination of different senses. Yeah, but yes, I was sharing.
Yeah, for me, when I presented the works, presenting the context was really important too. So every time, the first time the works were presented in Italy, I kind of said something probably not as extensive as I did in the paper and today, but to provide a context for the works. And there were later, some of them were shown in Melbourne as well. And I believe the curator had panels which kind of had a synopsis of that extra connection, because it's about kind of alerting people, kind of alerting to the conscious experience. People could be having just the sensory experience of the work, and hopefully, if they had been alerted to trying to notice that the way that the sounds and the tastes interacted, that they would have got that kind of level of interaction. But I thought it was also important that it was so much, the context of the work was so important that it was kind of integral, really, to presenting the work, to frame it within the project and frame it within those interactions that I had with the particular wine grower.
I think we could add something about Géraldine's project here too. Is that the constraints of what was produced were really there because of the way that Géraldine imagined imagined a future installation of these technologies and of this experience. So it was always framed, and you can speak for that yourself in a second, but I'll just sort of say a few words about that. Is the project was also always conceived as an exhibition, which is why it was important that the devices remain small. And there was this idea that the participants, I can't remember if you wanted what you would tell them when they first went into the room, but the idea was that when they exited the room, there would be a sort of mediation process with the participants where you would discuss their experience, and that would be sort of where you'd have the opportunity to create a sort of education about neurodiversity issues. So the constraint remained that it'd be small because it was always considered as part of eventually being part of an exhibition space or something that people could walk around with. And maybe Géraldine, you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, for my project, the aim was to build an installation where people didn't have any context when they enter the room. So what we wanted was because it was just like a part of the whole exhibition, I designed it, which never took place because it's not all, as well understood. But there were like different devices, and people would have different devices, technological devices on them, and they would not know what they were going to enter in, and they shouldn't know before, because the goal was to make them feel the stuff. And I think like more you give context, more you influence the person on the experience. And it's important for me that when you speak about neurodiversity, that to make people enjoy the difference before and to experiment by themselves. And then at the end, when they will give back the old devices, they would have been an explanation, and the context would have been given at the end to make them reflect on about their own experience. So the idea was to start with the experience, the experiment, and then give the context.
Thanks very much, all. As has been said before as well by Clarissa and also with people in the chat, there is some really nice links, I think, between the research that you do, although you approach it from different perspectives, perhaps, and certainly with different topics. How do you each see this relation between these three different approaches? Have you, and that's perhaps very early days to say right now, but how could you use, or what could you learn from each other in that sense? And perhaps can I start with you, Clarissa, because you mentioned that as something as well.
Sure. I think the main connection is the conversation about the senses, yeah, or the sensorium, and each one of us, we are exploring from a different perspective, but at the same time, we are sort of envisaging or reaching a similar place, I think, yeah. And I was curious to understand the idea of recording the growth or the movements, the teeny movements, or the energy circulation in the vineyards or the vines, and how, if you can have by the end a huge library mentioning all the aspects or the how can I say, I cannot find a word, but the more objective aspects that influence this resultant sound, I think. And when you girls were talking about the synesthesia and mentioning drugs, it instantaneously led me to this chemical place, because I'm interested in this kind of connections, yeah. And yeah, when we think about schizophrenia, or we think about drugs in general, the way these conditions, these states, they change the flow, or the way the information is structured in a static way in our bodies. I think we're talking about the same thing. We're all talking about information circulating in our body as a structure we can sort of, or in some ways, isolate from the whole to understand, I think, yeah. But we are all talking about the information we receive and that structures us. And I think I gave Mert the wrong answer. Yeah, for sure, yes. Yeah. Because the microbiome, no matter it's the phyllosphere microbiome, is part of the tree itself, yeah. And sure, it's integrated with the organism and influences the tree's consciousness as well, right? Sorry for that.
Maybe just to bounce off of that, I think what's interesting, sort of even beyond just the sensorium, the senses, but also outside of the particular differences of the senses that we're interested in, is the challenge of what remains is the challenge of how we talk about these things, and the languages that we have to talk about these things, and the metaphors we use, and that we're all kind of trying to find in some way descriptions or experiences that will do something, or ways of talking about certain things, and we never can know if someone else is, what we describe as this is the same as that person. So I think this question of just how we talk about the limits of language really is something Géraldine mentioned, but I think it does cut across the concerns about how we describe sensory perception and
I think I think we're all kind of talking about heightening kind of the consciousness of the connections which are there through using the senses, which is something kind of I felt like I perceived in all the presentations. With Clarissa, it's at a molecular level, and then kind of at a synesthetic level, and for me it was kind of a cultural and a cross-modal level. I just actually wanted to kind of mention kind of relevant to kind of synesthesia versus kind of the cross-modal correspondences that I work with, because I decided not to work with synesthesia because there wasn't enough shared connections there, because of this idiosyncratic and the rareness of the condition. I ended up feeling that was kind of, I became more interested personally in cross-modal correspondences, which are a lot more shared. So there's a lot more possibilities to make connections with more people. So that's why I went down that cross-modal path, and the fact that if we actually become more conscious about our own experiences, that we might find that we are making these associations. We don't need to be synesthetes. It could be kind of working as cross-modal correspondences apart, but we're just not conscious of that. So.
Great, thanks very much, all of you. Is there any last comments that you'd like to make? I'm looking also in the chat, but there's currently no more questions coming in. And we're also approaching the time, so any last words?
And last words.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Session. It was a great pleasure, and I learned a lot from all of you girls. Yeah. All girls session. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some really interesting projects. It was great to be part of this panel.
You were supposed to bring wine. Yeah, but here's more.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think it was really interesting because I feel like in wine there is many sensory stimulation, and like you say, like I feel like taste and smell are really like linked, and they work together. And this is like, it was really interesting to see, like, as you say, like cross-modal. It's how synesthesia works, but I think there is a deep, we don't have time to discuss that, but there is a deep link between synesthesia and culture, because culture use all the time metaphors in different languages and how they built. And it's not like, what I want to say is like there is so much more to discover how culture integrates synesthetes experiment that we know, because it's a new form of it's not a new format, it's a new study, because mainly like the studies about synesthesia are about how it works, but there is no many studies about what synesthete brings into the world, or what like the sociology, you know what I mean, like the sociology of synesthesia. So I think in the wine tasting there is many of them, more than you can guess.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you all very much, and also thank you for making the connections between yourselves and giving each other the space and opportunities to answer and make the summaries as well. There's really nice last question in a way from the audience listening and looking at us, and that's like, will you continue discussing projects together? And yeah, there seems to be fertile ground to do that. So yeah, hopefully we'll remain in touch somehow. Thank you very much again, and thank you for the audience for helping us getting all this information out of these presentations. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.